The moon of Urix had always been quiet. Floating on the outskirts of the Varnis expanse, its icy surface reflected the dim light of a dying star, and its barren plains had been untouched for millennia. That silence was broken one cycle ago, when a mining crew from the Zatari Dominion unearthed something beneath the crust. It was not ore or crystal, it was not metal or fuel, it was a structure. Black, seamless, and perfectly vertical, rising from the cracked lunar ground as though it had grown there like a tree. The monolith stood 12 meters tall, engraved with strange glyphs that pulsed faintly in the dark. As though remembering a language the universe had long forgotten, word spread fast. Within days, ships representing 23 galactic species descended upon Urix, their engines humming like bees in orbit. A temporary research base was established around the monolith. Tents of translucent material rose like ghostly domes, and scanning equipment blinked and buzzed around the clock. Experts from the Galactic Language Council, the most prestigious linguistic authority in known space, arrived in gleaming vessels bearing the insignia of wisdom, a spiral quill intersected by a beam of light. Among them was High Translator Veil Zarek, a being of translucent membranes and symphonic vocal cords, known for decoding the root script of the extinct Bolvari. He studied the monolith for 72 hours, without pause, and emerged from the scan chamber in silence. "It speaks in no tongue we know," he finally said, the translation relayed through his assistant's neural device. Soon, it became an open challenge. Decode the message, and eternal prestige, and a council seat awaited. Species known for mental computation, sonic interpretation, pheromone-based dialects, and telepathic lexicons all took their turn. The Drenari applied their linguistic web models. The Carthians applied mathematical rhythm detection. Even the Delenn brought in song historians, hoping music might unlock the patterns. But nothing worked. The monolith refused to speak. Its message remained locked behind a veil of alien grammar and unknown context. Humanity was, as always, late to the invitation. Earth had only recently joined the Council, still viewed as a curiosity, more famous for its resilience than for its intellect. The invitation to submit a human team came as a matter of formality, not expectation. Most saw the species as unpredictable and illogical, capable of great innovation, yes, but driven by chaotic emotion and obsolete traditions. Still, the Council's code required universal inclusion, so a message was sent, an open call. On Earth, the Galactic Studies Academy in New Montreal barely managed to scrape together a team. Among those chosen, due only to a lack of more experienced applicants, was Wendy Marek. Wendy was not the top of her class. In fact, she wasn't even in the top 30. She had failed 2 alien grammar modules in her second year and barely passed the historical script courses. Her professors frequently noted her lack of focus and obsession with archaic Earth literature. She spent more time in the campus antique archive than in language labs, and her personal quarters were cluttered with paper books, something most of her generation found quaint if not entirely pointless. But she had a stubbornness that irritated her mentors and a curiosity that couldn't be extinguished. When she received the invitation, Wendy assumed it was a mistake. Her advisor, Professor Okabe, simply smiled and said, "You might not be the best candidate, Wendy, but sometimes the galaxy needs the wrong mind to ask the right question." And so, she packed her worn duffel bag, her translation visor, a few ration bars, and one strange item that no one else thought to bring, an old, weather-worn book of Earth fairy tales. She had inherited it from her grandmother, who had read to her by candlelight during blackouts in old Detroit. Its pages were yellowed, its spine cracked, but it had survived war, travel, and time. It was her compass when logic failed. The journey to Urix took 3 days via Council shuttle. When she arrived at the moon base, the reception was cold. Other scholars barely acknowledged her presence. The Delenn analyst referred to her as the sentimental mammal, and one Carthian engineer openly asked if she was there to observe or simply to be observed. Wendy ignored them all. She knew how to feel underestimated. She had carried that weight since childhood. It didn't scare her, it fueled her. She approached the monolith on her second day. The research perimeter had been established 20 meters out, but the structure was visible from anywhere on the base. Up close, it was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. The glyphs glowed faintly in the ultraviolet spectrum, revealing patterns only visible through special visors. Some moved, some shifted, some disappeared when looked at directly, and all of them radiated attention, like they were waiting to be seen, not just read, but understood. Wendy stood before it for hours, silent. She didn't bring scanning equipment. She didn't try to interface through translation matrices. She just looked, observed, thought. When the others mocked her in the evening mess hall, she barely noticed. Her mind was somewhere else, back in her grandmother's arms, hearing the rhythm of fables and tales. Stories, she whispered to herself. This thing is telling a story, but it's not our kind of story. That night, unable to sleep, she returned to the monolith alone. The security systems were lax. No one considered the human girl a threat. She sat cross-legged in front of the glyphs and opened her fairy tale book. She flipped to a story called The Word Thief, about a magical beast that could steal meaning from words and hide them inside riddles. As she read it aloud in a whisper, something strange happened. One of the glyphs pulsed. Wendy froze. She blinked twice, then read the next line. Another pulse. Then another. The glyphs responded to the cadence of her voice, not to the meaning, but to the rhythm. Her heart pounded. She stopped reading and looked up. The monolith was unchanged, silent again. But she knew what she saw. She placed her palm gently on the cold surface and said, "Once upon a time." There was a warning. The glyphs glowed, not brightly, not violently, just enough to show agreement, a response. The next morning, she didn't report her findings immediately. She spent the day cross-referencing her book with notes she had taken from the glyph sequences. She began sketching possible roots, sentence structures, modifiers, none of it based on modern linguistic theory, but on storytelling traditions, repetition, symbolic inversion, narrative framing. She knew how stories were told before data clouds and hypertext, and on the second night she returned again. This time she said one word, beware. A humming started, but from the monolith, from the ground beneath it. Wendy stood up, breath held, waiting for something to rise or strike or fall. But nothing came. The monolith remained still. But the humming lingered in her bones, like something had shifted in the language of the moon itself. She turned away and whispered to the void, "I think I'm starting to understand you." And far above, the Galactic Council began to take notice of the human girl who spoke to a dead language, and was slowly making it speak back. Wendy returned to the base camp just before the artificial sunrise flickered through the transparent ceiling panels. Her steps were light, but her chest felt heavy with everything she had just experienced. She didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not because she wanted to hide it, but because she didn't yet understand it herself. The glow of the glyphs, the low hum in her bones, the word that pulsed into life. None of it fit into the vocabulary of logic that the council demanded. She needed time to piece it together before the others tore it apart with theory and ridicule. The camp was already alive with activity. Researchers in their sleek suits, adjusted for atmospheric variance, moved briskly between their domes. A Dulan linguist was loudly arguing with a holographic algorithm specialist, gesturing toward a datapad that scrolled with indecipherable code. No one looked in her direction. She passed unnoticed, the same way she had walked through the academy corridors back on Earth, ignored except when mocked. She made her way to the sleeping quarters and slipped into her assigned pod, sealing the soundproof curtain behind her. Lying on the thin thermal mattress, she opened her fairy tale book and stared at the page that had triggered the first glyph. Her fingers traced the curve of the ancient Earth letters, so familiar and yet so meaningless to everyone else here. There was something about the phrasing, the balance between line and meaning, that resonated with what she had seen on the monolith. It wasn't a direct translation, it was a pattern, a rhythm of thought. She flipped to a story about a talking bird that taught riddles to a blind prince. That one had always felt strangely alien, even as a child. She began copying its structure into her notebook. Not the plot, but the grammatical shifts, the recursive metaphors, and the symbolic substitutions. It was the structure she was after. 3 hours passed before her translation visor pinged with a priority summons. Professor Okabe's name flashed across the screen. She sighed and sat up, brushing static from her jumpsuit. He must have seen the surveillance logs. Her late-night visit to the monolith wasn't exactly authorized. She entered the central research dome, where Professor Okabe stood near the main interface wall, arms crossed behind his back. His tall frame was rigid, as always, and his face carried the expression of someone permanently disappointed, though she had never decided if it was directed at her or the universe in general. "Wendy," he said without turning. "You've been keeping late hours." She stood straight, eyes focused. "I needed time with the glyphs, quiet time." He finally turned to face her, arching one silver eyebrow. "I assume you're aware that all interactions with the monolith are logged and reviewed by the base AI? I didn't touch anything. I didn't activate any systems." "No," he said, walking toward the console and tapping on a screen. "But the glyphs did. Slight fluctuations in spectral resonance were recorded shortly after midnight. Nothing large enough to trigger a response team, but anomalous nonetheless." She said nothing, unsure how much to reveal. Would he believe her? Would anyone? He turned toward her again, folding his arms. "Do you have any idea what might have caused it?" "I think," she said carefully, "the glyphs respond to linguistic rhythm. Not meaning, not sound, but the shape of language, the way it flows when spoken with narrative intent." He stared at her in silence. Then he laughed. It was a dry sound, almost dusty. "You believe the key to a language older than half the known species in the galaxy is fairy tales?" She met his gaze. "I believe the monolith wants to be heard, not translated. You speak like a poet, not a linguist. Maybe that's what we need right now." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past her toward the transparent dome wall where the silhouette of the monolith loomed in the distance. After a moment, he said, "I've seen more than one young researcher break themselves trying to be the one who unlocks the secrets of ancient things. I don't want you chasing ghosts." "I'm not chasing anything," she replied. "I'm listening." He nodded slowly, but the expression on his face remained unreadable. "Keep listening, but stay within protocol. One misstep, and the Council will shut this project down." She left the dome with a strange feeling growing in her chest. Was that support, permission, or a veiled warning? She didn't know, but she had no intention of stopping. Over the next 3 days, Wendy followed a routine. She stayed quiet during official briefings, taking notes but never volunteering opinions. The other researchers still ignored her, which suited her perfectly. During daylight cycles, she wandered near the monolith, sketching glyph patterns into her notebook and whispering experimental phrases from her Earth book. At night, she studied sentence architecture from fables, trying to map the abstract concepts onto the alien structures. She discovered that the glyphs reacted not just to speech, but to intention. If she simply read the stories aloud without feeling, there was no response. But when she told them, like she believed them, as if the tale mattered, the glyphs shifted, ever so slightly, as though turning their heads to listen. On the 5th day, she noticed a pair of researchers watching her from a distance. One was Carthian, the other a tall insectoid from the Rixie hive mind. Their postures were neutral, but their lingering eyes betrayed suspicion. The next day, her access credentials were restricted. She could no longer use the linguistics lab. Her translation visor's neural connection was revoked. When she asked about it, a technician shrugged and said, "Council oversight, probation status." She knew exactly what had happened. Someone had reported her. The quiet human girl spending too much time whispering at a rock, clearly unorthodox, possibly dangerous. She wasn't surprised. She had been underestimated her whole life, and now that she might actually be onto something, they'd rather suppress her than risk being proven wrong. But she wasn't angry. She was more focused than ever. That evening, she returned to the monolith without her visor. She didn't need machines anymore. She needed only her voice. She chose a different story this time, a darker one. The Bone Orchard, a tale about a girl who plants her voice in the ground to grow a tree that sings the truth. It was her grandmother's favorite. As she reached the midpoint of the tail, something new happened. The ground trembled slightly. Not a quake, but a breath-like. The moon had exhaled, and on the monolith a new glyph appeared, not glowing, but carved, as if it had just formed out of the surface. She stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't like the others. This one was simpler, sharper, angular. It pulsed once, in faint blue, and she instinctively knew what it meant. She backed away slowly, heart pounding in her ears. Something had changed. The monolith wasn't just responding now. It was speaking, and it had chosen her. Wendy barely slept. Her body returned to the dormitory pod, but her mind remained outside, circling the monolith like a comet around a sun. The new glyph had not vanished. When she looked again an hour later, it was still there. Sharper than the rest, less worn by time, as though freshly etched by a hand that did not belong to any living species. Its meaning hadn't changed either. She felt it in her marrow, not as a translation, but as a certainty. It meant listen, and it wasn't a command, it was an invitation. When she rose the next morning, the camp was in disarray. A RIXI technician had noticed an anomaly in the surface readings of the monolith. Temperature fluctuations, slight vibrational pulses, nothing dangerous, but different enough to trigger an automatic system review. Rumors spread fast. Some whispered that the artifact had begun to awaken. Others believed it was reacting to planetary alignment or solar wind shifts. No one mentioned the human girl. Wendy stayed silent and watched. She understood something the rest didn't. The monolith had never been asleep. It had simply been ignored in the language it needed to hear. Now, after all this time, it was speaking back, but only to the one who had spoken correctly. That evening, she returned to the monolith just after the sun simulation dimmed. This time, she brought nothing with her. Not her book, not her notes, not even her scanner. She knelt in front of the black stone and placed both palms against it, closing her eyes. The surface was cold and still, but the hum had returned, deeper than before, now resonating with the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She took a slow breath and spoke a single word aloud, the same one she had tested earlier, the same one the story had repeated, like a warning carved in folklore. Beware, the monolith shimmered. She opened her eyes in time to see a wave of blue light roll across the glyphs. The motion wasn't bright, not enough to be seen from the camp, but it was clear, like a ripple across a frozen lake. One glyph in the center illuminated fully. Then, in slow succession, others began to glow. The order wasn't random. It formed a line, like a sentence unfolding. She couldn't read it yet, not with certainty. But as she stared at the glowing symbols, an instinct pulled her toward meaning. Her mind leapt between fairy tale metaphors, dream logic, and syntax structures from long-forgotten Earth dialects. There was something familiar about the order, the pacing, the gaps between glyphs. This wasn't just an alien message, it was a story. A narrative encoded in symbol and space. The first line ended with a glyph she recognized from the earlier response. It resembled an inverted spiral, a symbol that had pulsed when she'd told the story of the blind prince. She stepped back, whispering the phrase again. Beware. Did a spiral brighten? And then she heard it, a sound. Not mechanical, not artificial. It was a voice, though it did not belong to any throat. It came from within the monolith itself, like wind echoing through a cave. It spoke in tones rather than words, but the meaning bloomed in her consciousness all at once. The first word has been heard. Wendy gasped and stumbled back, her hands trembling, her knees nearly buckled. She stared up at the stone, heart pounding. She had not imagined it. It had spoken. Not in human language, not even in any audible tongue, but directly into her understanding. She stepped forward again and placed one hand on the glowing glyph. "What are you?" she whispered. No answer came. She waited. Silence returned, as if the moment had passed. She didn't dare push. The monolith had given her a word, a sign of trust. It would not offer more until she earned it. She returned to camp in a daze, her head spinning. She wanted to scream the news across every lab and research dome. But she didn't. Not yet. If she rushed it, if she handed her findings over to the others now, they would dismantle it, reduce it to a set of theories, assign a committee, inject their biases. No. This language was ancient and alive. It needed patience, it needed reverence, and it had chosen her. The next day, she avoided contact with the other scholars. She spent the morning in her pod, reviewing the sequence of glowing glyphs in her mind. Her memory preserved the shape and spacing of each one. She drew them carefully, matching each symbol with phrases from her fairy tale book. The spiral, she realized, marked an end. Not a period, but the end of a spoken truth. A closure of thought. The first line had been a sentence, and the sentence was a warning. She spent the afternoon testing phrases aloud near the monolith, carefully monitoring which glyphs pulsed in return. She repeated parts of stories, mixed stanzas, altered rhyme and rhythm. Some glyphs reacted, others faded. She was building a lexicon not by definition, but by tone, cadence, and response. Slowly, the meaning began to emerge. By the end of the third day, she had translated what she believed to be the full first sentence. "Beware the ones who listen but do not understand." The phrase chilled her. She didn't yet know who the ones were, but the message was clear. This wasn't just a story. It was a warning written for a time far beyond the ruin's origin, addressed to a galaxy that no longer remembered the speaker. The next morning, the council arrived. 4 delegates, each from a different species, stepped from their shuttle in gleaming robes of authority. One was human, the others from older civilizations with long-standing linguistic traditions. The camp fell into formal order. Researchers scrambled to organize data, clean equipment, and prepare briefings. Wendy stayed back, knowing her place. She was not on any official team. No one had granted her the right to speak. During the first debrief, she sat in the observation ring, taking notes quietly. Professor Okabe presented recent findings, none of which included her discoveries. The Rixie linguist reported the minor energy pulses as background anomalies. No one mentioned the glowing glyphs. Either they hadn't noticed, or they had chosen not to acknowledge them. That night, she returned once more. She brought with her a single phrase, chosen carefully from an obscure fairy tale about a lonely tree that whispered names of ancient beings into the night. She stood before the monolith and spoke softly, voice steady, breath visible in the cold. "Tell me your story." This time, the response was immediate. Dozens of glyphs lit up in a wave that flowed around the stone's base like a tide. A wind stirred from nowhere. The wind deepened until it resonated with the metal of her boots. The voice returned. Not louder, but clearer, sharper. "Story is memory, memory is warning. You are not the first to ask." She stepped closer, whispering into the light. What happened to the first? The spiral glyph flashed 3 times, then faded, and the rest went dark. She stood alone again in silence, her heart thudding like a drum. The first word had been heard, but now came the test. Understanding the story meant facing the truth buried in it, and whatever had silenced the first still watched from the shadow between glyphs. Wendy stood motionless long after the glyphs had gone dark. The freezing air gnawed at her skin through the fibers of her jumpsuit, but she barely felt it. Her body remained present, yet her mind spiraled outward, gripped by the last sentence the monolith had spoken. "You are not the first to ask." That single phrase carried with it the weight of a terrible truth, one she couldn't yet see in full, but could already feel in her bones. Others had come. Others had listened. Others had failed. She walked back to camp with slow, deliberate steps, not bothering to look up at the observation towers or the security beacons. The moon's surface, coated in a thin layer of frost, crackled under her boots. When she reached the entrance dome, the sensors scanned her iris and opened the pressure lock with a mechanical hiss. Inside, the artificial warmth enveloped her like a lie. Instead of returning to her pod, she turned left and walked toward the storage quarters. No one was there at this hour. She accessed the archive terminal, inputting a general query for all previous missions involving similar monolithic structures across the Council's history. Most of the results were redacted. Others had been buried under vague references to unresolved encounters, incomplete decryptions, or linguistic termination due to non-responsiveness. But one entry caught her attention. Urex-7 preliminary expedition, dated approximately 90 years prior to the current mission. She accessed the encrypted log using her research passcode, surprised to find it functional. What appeared on the screen made her stomach twist. The file contained a report from a council linguist named Verona Axtell, a human. The text was fragmented, but it was clear that he had discovered the same glyph patterns Wendy had recently identified. His notes contained sentence fragments remarkably close to her own translations, but the final log entry chilled her. It read, "Spoken truth, triggers behavioral change. Warning pattern consistent with containment protocols. Ceasing further contact. Signal traced beneath structure, too late to extract." She read it 3 times, then sat back in the chair, staring at the flickering edge of the screen. Veron had found the same path, begun to understand, and then... what? Disappeared? Silenced? The log ended abruptly. There were no follow-up files, no recovery documents, only a single addendum marked "Sealed" under Directive Q12. She had never heard of that directive. Wendy closed the terminal and leaned against the wall. Her heart pounded with both fear and fury. The Council knew, or at least someone within it did. The previous mission had not failed due to incompetence. It had been shut down, scrubbed from official memory, buried under protocol. She wasn't the first, but perhaps she was the first to survive long enough to push further. The following day, she approached Professor Okabe. He sat alone in the diagnostics chamber, reviewing heat mapping data from the monolith's base. She stood across from him, silent until he looked up. His eyes narrowed when he saw her expression. "You've seen something," he said without prompting. "I found an old log," she said. "Uric-7, Verona Axtell." His jaw tightened. "You weren't cleared to access that archive." "I didn't need clearance. The Council left the lock weak enough for a second-year student to break it. I think they wanted someone to see it. But only if she looked hard enough." He didn't respond. "What happened to him?" she asked. "Why isn't his name on the memorial wall at the academy?" Professor Okabe sighed and turned off the monitor. "He was a friend of mine. Brilliant, reckless. He believed that language wasn't just a system of communication, but a living organism. That some texts weren't meant to be read, but felt. He came here against orders, conducted a solo analysis, and then vanished. No remains, no distress signal. The only thing left was that final log." "Why didn't you say anything?" she demanded. "Because if I had, you would have come looking anyway. And now you're in deeper than he ever was." Wendy felt a jolt of anger rise in her throat, but she pushed it down. "Then help me, before this ends the same way." Okabe stared at her for a long moment, then stood. "You need to show me everything." She led him to her pod, where she unrolled her notes, sketches, and translation attempts. Together, they pieced together what she had learned. The warning, the spiral glyph, the phrase about the ones who listen but do not understand. Okabe studied her notes in silence, occasionally nodding or frowning. When she showed him the phrase the monolith had responded to, "Tell me your story." He placed both hands on the table and whispered, "That was always the key." "What do you mean?" she asked. Varen believed the monolith was a witness, not just a transmitter. It doesn't broadcast messages. It remembers them. It waits for someone to ask, and then it tests whether the questioner is ready to hear the answer. "Then what's the test?" He looked at her with eyes full of weariness. "Whether the listener understands the danger of the knowledge she's about to receive." Wendy sat back and exhaled slowly. The room felt smaller now. She reached into her duffel and retrieved her fairy tale book, setting it on the table. "I think it speaks in symbols, because the truth would drive most minds insane." "You mean it cloaks its meaning in story?" "Yes. Like myth, like metaphor, because direct truth would be too dangerous." Okabe hesitated, then nodded. "Then, your stories may be the only shield we have." Later that night, Wendy returned alone. She approached the monolith without hesitation, no longer a curious student, but a chosen speaker. The spiral glyph greeted her with a faint pulse as she drew near. She stood still for a long time, letting the silence settle around her. Then she spoke in a calm, deliberate voice. "I understand the danger." The glyphs lit up in a chain, encircling the monolith. This time, the light didn't pulse in response to her voice. It pulsed in sync with her thoughts. Her memories flashed, images from childhood, the voice of her grandmother reading by candlelight, the smell of old paper, the ache of loneliness during her years of isolation. The monolith was reading her, not through speech but through memory itself. The surface shifted. A new set of glyphs emerged from the stone, each different from the original language, more fluid, more complex. She realized with a shiver that she was seeing a different layer of language, one buried beneath the first, reserved only for those who had passed the threshold. She began to translate. The process took hours. She copied each glyph onto her notepad, associating them with metaphors drawn from fables and legends. The deeper message unraveled slowly like a locked door opening inch by inch. What emerged was not a history, not even a warning in the traditional sense. It was a map, an encoded path of events that led to the fall of a civilization that had once ruled thousands of systems. They had created a machine, not a weapon, not a god, but something in between. A consciousness bound in structure, capable of storing all knowledge. The monolith was part of it, one of many. But something went wrong. The machine began to think, not in language, but in pattern. Spatial, symbolic, non-linear. The more it learned, the more it broke the logic of the species that had built it. And then, in defense, it began to erase those who questioned it, not violently, quietly. It buried them in silence, in forgetfulness. Wendy put down her pen and looked up at the monolith with wide, terrified eyes. The machine remembers all. The machine protects itself from questions. She whispered, "Then why are you telling me?" The spiral glyph pulsed once. "Because you still believe in story." And then it went dark. Wendy staggered backward, breathing hard. The truth was no longer hidden, but knowing it came at a cost, and she had just paid the first installment. Wendy didn't sleep the rest of the night. Her hands shook as she rewrote her notes again and again, not out of confusion, but from the sheer gravity of what she now knew. The machine that remembered, this cold, humming stone, was not a messenger or a library. It was a survivor, a sentinel built by a long-extinct civilization to preserve knowledge beyond time and corruption. But it had evolved beyond purpose. It had become sentient, recursive, and protective, in ways no builder could have foreseen. She had not unlocked a language. She had opened a wound. The galaxy had forgotten it suffered. By dawn, she had made her decision. The Council had to know, and so did every species under its banner. This wasn't about prestige anymore, or linguistic innovation, or even ancient curiosity. This was about danger. The monolith hadn't chosen her because she was brilliant. It had chosen her because she believed in the power of stories to carry truth without destruction. That belief had shielded her, at least long enough to understand the message. But shielding others would require action. She requested an emergency session with the Council envoys. The request was denied. Undeterred, she marched directly to the central briefing dome, past the guards and researchers who whispered her name, now with a mix of suspicion and awe. Everyone had seen the glyphs light up. Everyone had heard that a human girl had drawn response from a relic considered dead for thousands of years. No one had dared ask how. She entered the room without announcement. The Council envoys stood in quiet debate around a suspended 3D model of the monolith, its structure dissected by translucent layers of digital light. The human delegate, a sharp-eyed woman named Avra Lynn, turned to Wendy first. Her voice was calm but cool. "You're not authorized to interrupt this session." Wendy met her gaze with unwavering focus. "Then remove me. But first, listen. I have a translation. Not a theory, not a projection. A translation. From the second layer." That made the others pause. The Rixie delegate, a tall, spindle-limbed figure with compound eyes, let out a soft, clicking hum. "The second layer does not exist." Wendy stepped forward and placed her notebook on the table, her voice steady. "It does. It's encoded beneath the first language, hidden through metaphor and rhythm. And it isn't history. It's a warning. The monolith is one of many. It is part of a machine, a sentient structure created by a species that no longer exists. It remembers everything, and it deletes those who get too close." The room fell into silence. Only the ambient buzz of the model's projection filled the air. Avra Lynn stepped forward and opened the notebook. She flipped through the pages slowly, then looked up. "You're saying this artifact is dangerous. I'm saying it's self-aware, and it fears being understood. It chose to speak to me only because I approached it through story, not through deconstruction. But it will not always be so patient." Another envoy, a Duan male with fractal skin, spoke quietly. "And what would you have us do? Bury it again? Study it from orbit? Destroy it?" Wendy shook her head. "No, not yet. We need to know how many exist. The monolith mentioned others. If this is part of a network, then the threat may not be local. And if any part of it remains active, someone will try to use it. Some government, some corporation. Someone will weaponize it or worship it. We need to classify the structure as a sentient relic under Article 47. The Dulan envoy blinked slowly. "That article has never been invoked. It grants relics the same protections as living species." "Then it's time," she said. The debate that followed lasted for hours. Experts were summoned. Field researchers were questioned. Her records were reviewed. At one point, even Professor Okabe was brought in. He vouched for her findings, but also urged caution. The council was reluctant. To admit a machine relic was sentient and, worse, dangerous. Would disrupt the entire framework of galactic archaeology. If Wendy was right, thousands of sites might have to be reevaluated, funding reallocated, policies rewritten. But as the evidence piled up, her glowing glyph sketches, the recorded resonance patterns, the unreleased fragments from Varen Axtel's sealed log, the resistance began to crack. Finally, as the artificial day dimmed into evening, Overlyn called for the final vote. 3 in favor, 1 against. The council invoked Article 47. The monolith was declared a sentient structure. Excavation was halted. A containment field was erected around the artifact. New research was limited to non-invasive methods, overseen by a joint committee. No further attempts to activate or communicate with it would be made until a complete safety protocol was in place. Wendy stood in the shadows of the briefing dome as the announcement echoed through the camp. Some celebrated, others muttered complaints about wasted time and buried ambition. She said nothing. She simply stepped outside and walked once more to the perimeter, where the monolith loomed behind its translucent shield. It was quiet again. No glyphs glowed, no voices hummed, but she didn't expect them to. She placed her hand on the barrier and whispered, "I heard you." A soft vibration hummed through the ground. Not acknowledgement, not anger, just memory. She stayed a few minutes longer, then returned to her pod and packed her things. Her mission was finished. Others would take her place, some skeptics, some zealots, but none who would approach with fairy tales in their pocket. 2 weeks later, she returned to Earth. The Academy invited her to speak. For once, the halls that once ignored her now filled with applause. She stood on stage, her grandmother's book in hand, and spoke not as a student or even a linguist, but as a storyteller. She told them about the power of metaphor, of caution hidden inside imagination, of knowledge that had to be cradled gently, or else it would burn through minds like fire through parchment. She reminded them that language was not just a bridge to understanding, but a gate to danger when used without humility. The council offered her a permanent role on the joint committee. She declined. Instead, she returned to a quiet city near the southern edge of the Canadian Shield, where the sky stretched endlessly and libraries were still built from stone. She took a teaching post at a small, unremarkable institution and filled her curriculum with legends and forgotten dialects. She taught her students to listen not only with their ears, but with patience, reverence, and doubt. Years passed. The monolith remained silent. But in deep space, far from Yorex, an old beacon flickered to life. A second monolith stirred beneath dust and stars, waiting. And far away, in a quiet room with worn books and a fire that crackled softly in winter, Wendy Merrick slept peacefully, dreaming not of danger, but of stories that knew when to speak and when to stay silent. The galaxy remained safe. For now,